Look, WHO needs to be much more transparent about what is going on in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. It needs to be open to different views from the views of people who have direct interests in nicotine in harm reduction, either because they're smokers or vapors. It needs to listen more carefully to their views, and it needs to be clearer about what it's actually doing. Now, it has been resistant to that in the past because it believes it's kind of trying to fight off tobacco industry influence. But in doing that, it's actually excluding a lot of legitimate points of view. So it does need to change. It does need to open up. It does need to include more observers with more diverse opinions. And it has an opportunity to do that for COP10. Okay, so the most important thing for people who have an interest in the outcome of the FCTC is to engage with national governments. National governments make all the decisions. They have to agree to any of the resolutions. They have to agree to any changes in the text or policies in the FCTC. So the main way that a normal citizen or a vaping organization or a vape shop or anything has to influence this process is to influence their own government. And I can't stress this enough. So people should be getting in touch with their health ministers, in touch with members of parliament to try and bring the issues out into the fore. So when the government goes to the conference of the parties, it goes with some sensible opinions and views in mind. And it's much more important to do that than it is to travel halfway around the world to try and influence the conference of the parties directly. It's much more important to do the basic work at home first and get your own government to understand and to take strong positions in favour of tobacco harm reduction. Well, we have to use the usual mixed strategy. So you would tend to have, you would try to create situations where the issues were examined, parliamentary inquiries, newspaper reports. You would try to get opposition politics interested in an issue, and you would try to raise challenging points with the politicians involved. So, for example, a lot of people think, well, it's easy, we'll ban these products or we'll make them more restricted. So let's have a conversation about the unintended perverse consequences of doing that. Let's talk about black markets. Let's talk about young people who would otherwise smoke and what happens to them. Let's talk about the effect on adults of depriving them of something that stops them smoking. Let's talk about organized crime, enforcement, discrimination, how this plays out with poorer people in society. You just have to make those arguments come alive to the decision makers in this so that they feel that they have to take these arguments more seriously. So you're right to some extent. The UK has been open to tobacco harm reduction. It has a core group of academics and experts that broadly support the concept of tobacco harm reduction. But one of the problems with international treaties is that a lot of countries will go to these meetings and they will have a kind of what I call a red line philosophy. So, is something being said here that we can't accept or would make us do something we don't want to do? And actually, the usual answer to that with the FCTC is no, it doesn't make us do anything. It doesn't stop us doing anything. The problem is that it creates certain norms. So if you have WHO, promoting prohibition, it doesn't make anybody prohibit it, but it just makes it more likely. It just makes it that countries will draw on WHO language to implement prohibitions. So that's why the UK doesn't intervene very much, because it doesn't make them do anything. Now that to me is a sort of cowardly and inadequate approach to international relations, but that's the approach they take. They look for anything that infringes their red lines, and other than that, they stay quiet. Well, that is a complete misunderstanding of what is going on. There is a technology change that is going on in the industry, which it amounts to a switch from combustible to non-combustible forms of nicotine. And these are much, much less harmful beyond any reasonable doubt. So that essentially is a good thing to happen. Now, it happens to be where some of the industry, but not all of the industry, want to go. I mean, there is nothing good for a big tobacco company to be a merchant of death. It's much better for them if their products don't kill millions of people every year. So unsurprisingly, they, if it's easy for them to do and it makes a reasonable business, would like to reduce the amount of death and disease caused by their product. The fact is that's an alignment between their goals and public health goals. Now, WHO just takes it as an article of faith that there is a fundamental and irreconcilable difference between the interests of the tobacco companies and the interests of public health. But in the case of tobacco harm reduction, that is wrong. And we know that's wrong because the country that has the lowest cigarette smoking rate in the world, bar a few small countries, is Sweden. And the reason it has that is because most people using nicotine in Sweden are using it in the form of snus, and they are much less, which is smokeless tobacco, and they are much less harmed as a result. Snus is a tobacco product made by a tobacco company, and yet it is responsible for the best public health outcomes in most of the world. So we can see a situation where tobacco industry and public health interests are aligned if it's to do with reducing the risk of the product, which in this case it is. So WHO has got itself into a ridiculous situation where it's refusing to accept something that would be extremely good for public health simply because it's coming from the tobacco industry and a lot of companies that are not in the tobacco industry. So they're the ones making the mistake there, and they are the ones who need to rethink their fundamental objections to innovation in tobacco products that reduces harm. Well, nicotine has been demonized because it's been deeply associated with smoking. And smoking is obviously, there's no doubt about this, a cause of cancer, cardiovascular disease, severe respiratory complaints like COPD and so on. So nicotine is deeply entwined with these diseases. And we haven't yet got to a state in which we think about nicotine purely independently of smoking and see it. When you do that, it starts to look like something that's much more like caffeine in terms of a drug, not particularly harmful, a stimulant. People don't get sick from it. People don't poison themselves on it. It doesn't cause accidents, doesn't cause violence. It doesn't cause people to lose the ability to carry on or oblivion like some drugs do. And we have yet to start to reconceptualize nicotine as a normal, fairly mild, fairly innocuous recreational drug. We still see it as deeply conflated with smoking and all the diseases associated with smoking. That will undo over time, and we will start to rethink nicotine. And when we do, we'll see a world, hopefully, that's much more open to nicotine use without all the harm. So the main things that consumers can do is to tell their story. Tell their story about the effect that the effect that harm reduction, vaping, or whatever they're using, did to stop them smoking, and how that journey actually worked, if that's what happened. But I think there's something more than that, which is to start to talk a bit more about what they get from nicotine. I mean, a lot of public health people think you don't get anything. They just think all you're getting is relief from withdrawal and craving. But as far as I understand it, and I've never used nicotine myself as a vapor or a smoker, people use nicotine to help them relax, to reduce anxiety, to control stress, to help them to concentrate. I think it would be good if people talked a bit more about that, about how it makes them feel and why they like using it, and maybe change the debate a bit, not just on harm, but also on this discussion about addiction.